As word begins to filter through of 901's apparent disappearance, Air New Zealand will move swiftly to examine the events surrounding the flight, in an effort to try and comprehend what has happened to the DC-10 and the 257 souls on board. Where was 901, and why had it apparently vanished without trace?
He's on 901 Auckland on 13304, do you read?
Yeah. Hey, listen, I'll call you back. Peter? Oh, hell.
Get on to the bus.
It's been 4 hours since any contact. At 16:25, 901 was due at latitude 60 degrees south. At that point, it should have switched from McMurdo Air Traffic Control back to New Zealand. It's possible the plane has lost all on-board communication, in which case the first we'll see or hear of them is when they come within range of Dunedin radar.
When would that be?
Dunedin radar has a range of 2 degrees, which takes us down to here. 901 ought to be within range of that radar by 18:30 hours. That's half an hour from now. Until then, we keep all frequencies open, alert all aircraft in the area, keep in touch with search and rescue at McMurdo, and hope like hell that phone rings.
Bruce, how's it going?
Not good. How do we cover that vast bloody ocean?
It's gone. There's nothing that would take out all the onboard communication systems for this long and leave the aircraft still able to fly.
Upgrade to distress phase. When does the fuel run out?
9:30.
It was good.
Science is a brain.
Oh, it's all right for you. You don't have to sit school seeing it tomorrow.
Down your study, Catherine, you'll be fine. A nice early night.
Can't we stop and wait for Dad?
Yay! No, not tonight. You've got to be on your toes tomorrow, girl, at your very best. Hello, Maria Collins.
Yes, it's David Eden, Director of Flight Operations, Mrs. Collins. I'm just ringing to let you know that there's been a problem with Jim's flight.
Who's got the spoon?
Jim's been out of radio contact for some time now, since about 2 p.m. in fact.
Now, there could be any number of reasons for that, and we'll let you know as soon as we know any more. But if you're on your own, it
Might be an idea if you get someone to come and sit with you.
It's a hoax. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't. The police come round even for a road accident.
Mum, what's the matter? Mum?
Hello? It's Mrs. Casson here. My husband's first officer on Flight 901. I've just had a call from a Captain Eden saying that the aircraft is overdue. Could you confirm that?
New Zealand 901 Auckland on New Zealand 901 Christchurch control on 1260. 901, this is Mayday 1260.
Mr. Davis?
DC-10 on a sightseeing flight over the Antarctic. Sources within Air New Zealand confirm that there has been no radio contact with the plane for some hours, and it's believed the plane will be out of fuel by 9:30 tonight. Air New Zealand says there was no immediate concern because there had been a solar flash.
Mr. Davis, we've just heard. Can we have a reaction?
Or electrical disturbance.
Get this bum out of here.
How do you feel, sir?
Might have got
How the hell do you think I feel?
Davis, out!
Now get out!
Mr. Davis!
Muslim students occupying the United States Embassy in
Mr. Davis, it's the Prime Minister's office.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great regret that we must accept that the aircraft is overdue.
Come on, Craig.
Haven't you got something new?
The aircraft carries extensive life support equipment, so in the event of something like...
Antarctic, Craig.
Mr. Saxon,
Where's
when
Morrie
is the Chief
Davies?
Executive going to say something?
Mr. Davis has been down in Wellington. He's on his way here now. He'll be making a statement in the boardroom as soon as he arrives.
When did you back?
Morrie Davies.
Fuel reserves exhausted.
As part of their immediate investigation during the night of November 28th, flight dispatch staff at Air New Zealand began the process of comparing 901's flight path with that of previous operations to Antarctica, looking for any possible clue which may provide some clarity as to what had happened to the flight. What they uncovered was nothing short of earth-shattering. While examining the coordinates of each of the filed waypoints along the respective routes, they discovered that unlike previous flights to McMurdo, the ill-fated flight's destination waypoint was different, and not by an insignificant amount.
Cape Hannett, latitude 7220.
Check 7220.
Longitude 17013.
Check 17013.
McMurdo, latitude 7753.
Check 7753.
Longitude 16448.
Check. No, again.
16448.
16658.
It's more than 2 degrees difference.
It's nearly 30 miles.
Brian Hewitt, who is it?
Alan Dorday here, Mr. Hewitt, flight dispatch.
What do you want?
We've discovered a 2-degree error in 901's destination waypoint at McMurdo.
It's not 2 degrees. It's an update of 2.1 miles. We put it in last night. And it's no concern of flight dispatch anyway.
What Alan Dorday and Flight Dispatch had actually discovered on the night of November 28th was a discrepancy in the stored computerized flight plan for Flight 901, which will strike right at the heart of the subsequent investigation, and which will be ultimately explained by Air New Zealand as follows. When the airline's operations into the Antarctic initially commenced with proving flights back in 1977, the destination waypoint for the first 2 flights was represented by the latitude and longitude coordinates of the landing strip at McMurdo, known as Williams Field. Those coordinates were 77 degrees 53 minutes south, 166 degrees 48 minutes east. To simplify, let's call this original track Alpha. However, as previously outlined, mid-1977 an application was made on the part of Air New Zealand and subsequently approved by the regulatory authority to lower the minimum safe altitude south of McMurdo from 16,000 feet to 6,000. The objective here was fairly straightforward. If flights were operating in visual meteorological conditions, that is clear of cloud, then a descent to the lower altitude would undoubtedly enhance the sightseeing experience for all those on board. If on the other hand the aircraft was operating under instrument conditions, that being in cloud with no external visual reference, then adherence to the published instrument cloud-based procedure, anchored to the McMurdo Non-Directional Navigation Beacon or NDB, could potentially also be used to guide the aircraft's descent to lower, clearer skies. Accordingly, as from the first of the late 1977 flights which occurred on the 18th of October that year, The destination waypoint out of necessity was altered so as now to coincide with the geographical position of the NDB, located in the general area of the US base at McMurdo Station, that being 77 degrees 51 minutes south, 166 degrees 41 minutes east. At this time, supposedly, the original waypoint at Williamsfield was become obsolete. The track to the revised destination waypoint is now depicted here as track Bravo. In real terms, this was a minor track adjustment and had little if any material impact on the operation, with the destination waypoint being shifted by no more than a couple of miles. Both tracks would, on the latter part of their arrival into Antarctica, bring the aircraft directly overhead the significant terrain of Ross Island. However, as the minimum en route altitude for the sector until arriving overhead the NDB was still set at 16,000 feet, Air New Zealand argued that a comfortable margin of terrain clearance would exist. As the whole purpose of these flights was to afford the passengers on board the best sightseeing experience possible, the objective was to find a way to safely descend the aircraft below 16,000 feet, which allegedly hadn't happened to date. With the destination waypoint now deliberately adjusted to anchor the flight plan on the McMurdo NDB, as mentioned earlier, the descent strategy could be achieved in one of two ways. Firstly, if flying in visual conditions once overhead the NDB, the aircraft could visually descend below 16,000 feet, with a minimum floor being set at 6,000. Secondly, if flying in cloud, the same descent could be initiated again to 6,000 feet, following the published cloud break instrument procedure based on the NDB itself, with a minimum stipulated cloud base and visibility for this procedure being set at 7,000 feet and 20 kilometres respectively. This would ensure that on completion of the procedure, the aircraft would be in good visual conditions from which to continue the sightseeing exercise. Regardless of the procedure followed, the intention was that the aircraft would descend into a defined sector to the south of a navigation facility in order to avoid the significant terrain of Ross Island immediately to the north. Although not physically necessary to complete the descending procedure for either visual or instrument conditions, surface radar at McMurdo was to be operational and available in order to monitor the flight's progress and facilitate coordination between Air New Zealand flights and any potential local traffic in the area. As time progressed, come 1978, Air New Zealand was to undertake an upgrade of its flight planning procedures. One such upgrade was the electronic storage of operational flight plans in a new computerized system. Essentially, the previous flight details used for all of the 1977 Antarctic flights were to become the standard stored electronic flight plan for the route, with each of the waypoints making up the route being transcribed from the paper original to an electronic format. However, when it came to inserting the final destination waypoint, in error, this was inserted as the original Williamsfield position associated with track Alpha and now obsolete, rather than the revised destination waypoint of the McMurdo NDB associated with track Bravo, and which had been the true destination waypoint for the last 4 flights of 1977. An explanation as to why this obsolete waypoint was inadvertently reintroduced into the equation was never forthcoming. Had this been the extent of the errors made in transcribing the flight plan from paper to electronic format, the matter would have innocently ended there. No great harm would have come to 901. Essentially, the initial movement of destination waypoint from Williamsfield to the NDB in order to facilitate the instrument letdown procedure would have simply been, well, reversed. But the matter didn't end there. This initial selection error, should you wish to call it that, was made by Mr. Brian Hewitt, Air New Zealand's chief navigator. But in what can only be described as a classic case of transposition error, when Hewitt subsequently went to transfer the Williamsfield position from paper to computer, instead of inserting its longitudinal position as 166 degrees 48 minutes east, he instead erroneously inserted it as 164 degrees 48 minutes east. Hewitt would later testify that standard practice was to check such insertion by looking at the visual display unit on the computer and comparing these figures with the original paper worksheets. However, in this instance, despite the fact that this was done, his transposition error had not been identified. Again, and although coincidental, this error in itself would not expose future flights to Antarctica to any greater level of danger, as the erroneous insertion of a 4 rather than a 6 had done nothing other than relocate the destination waypoint to a position some 25 miles west of the NDB navigation facility, geographically close to the Daly Islands, indicated now as Track Charlie. All that said, as this false destination waypoint in McMurdo Sound was now no longer co-located with the NDB, the instrument letdown procedure could no longer be used. But despite this fact, the waypoint would remain in the system unnoticed for another 14 months, until being finally noticed by one Captain Les Simpson, commander of the Antarctic flight previous to Collins 901, on November the 14th, exactly 2 weeks before the accident. For reasons which will become apparent during the subsequent investigation, most flights would eventually deviate from the filed flight plan in order to optimise the sightseeing experience in advance of reaching the destination waypoint. But on the afternoon of November 14, Simpson, uncharacteristically, had taken his aircraft the full length of the sound. In doing so, what he noticed was that the destination waypoint actually lay some 27 nautical miles due west of the recently installed TACAN navigation aid at Williams Field. On his return to Auckland, he reported his observation to Air New Zealand, not, in his own words, to imply that any error had been made in the positioning of the waypoint itself, but merely to draw attention to the fact, lest subsequent crews were surprised by the fact, as he was. And so it came to be that at approximately 1:40 a.m. on the morning of November 28, 1979, a mere 6.5 hours before Jim Collins and his crew departed for Antarctica on the ill-fated Flight 901, the issue of the false destination waypoint was finally corrected. According to Brian Hewitt's testimony, the navigation section, never having been aware of the original transposition error, corrected what they thought was a destination waypoint located overhead the NDB, to the more valid position of overhead the new TACAN navigation aid at Williams Field, a move which they assumed logical for two reasons. By this time the NDB had been withdrawn from service, and secondly, good practice and aviation convention would routinely have most flight plans, where possible, terminated at a defined navigation aid. So it was their assumption that in moving the destination waypoint from where they believed it to be, overhead the NDB, to the revised location overhead the TACAN, a correction, or rather an adjustment, of a mere 2.1 nautical miles had been made, and as such no material impact on the overall flight had resulted. However, in truth, what they had unknowingly done was to shift the destination waypoint from 164 degrees east, where it had innocently laid for the last 14 months, to 166 degrees east, overhead the TACAN, a shift of not 2 nautical miles, but 27 nautical miles, incurring a revised track which would no longer take the aircraft down the wide open expanse of McMurdo Sound, but rather directly over Ross Island and the towering peak of Mt.Erebus at 12,448 feet above sea level, shown now here as Track Delta. As will be shown later, more than one flight crew will eventually testify that the mandatory briefing they received from Air New Zealand prior to the flight always suggested that Track Charlie, although created an error, was to be the expected flight plan track, and that over time consensus had simply accepted this as being the definitive route to be flown. If this was indeed the understanding amongst the pilot group at large, then a shift of this magnitude, particularly in light of the obvious terrain implications, should have been notified to the crew prior to departure. The truth is, however, with their false belief that the correction was only one of 2 nautical miles and not 27, the navigation section had assessed the correction as being largely irrelevant, and as such, no one had seen a need to inform Collins, because in their eyes it simply wasn't necessary.
Is it true, Mr. Davis, that delegates to the 10th Antarctic Treaty meeting 6 weeks ago warned member governments to discourage sightseeing flights to the Antarctic because of the danger?
Are you saying they know more about flying than we do?
What's your reaction, Mr. Davis, to Air New Zealand's first loss of a commercial flight?
Well, that question makes me sick. We're terrified. These are the kind of circumstances that chill us all. It's appalling.
In news just to hand, Air New Zealand has announced that the wreckage of Flight 901 has been found on the flanks of Mt.Erebus, a 13,000-foot volcano in Antarctica. The indications are that there are no survivors of the 257 passengers or crew. And just repeating that news, Air New Zealand has announced that the wreckage of Flight 901 has been found in Antarctica.
Seven people have died, but those figures alone do not indicate the depth of the tragedy for New Zealand. The ripples spread through a small society and touch almost everybody. There's an immediate tide of public sympathy for the bereaved, and also for the airline. After the first reaction of sympathy, there's another. How did it happen? Ron Chippendale, the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, will be the first to answer that question. He will be assisted at the crash site by Air New Zealand's chief pilot, Ian Gemmell. Already in the navigation section of Air New Zealand, the question of cause is being addressed. Keith Amies is an authority on the sophisticated inertial navigation system that guides the DC-10. He's been unable to sleep since he was telephoned during the night. Amies calls up the flight plan for the previous week's flight and looks particularly for the McMurdo coordinates. From these figures, he plots the route taken by that flight down McMurdo Sound. He then calls up Collins' flight plan to compare it with the previous week's. His worst fears are confirmed. The destination coordinates are different. When he plots these coordinates, they take the route on a direct line over Mt.Erebus.
Keith? Have you got a paper? Did you speak to Hewitt?
The error wasn't in 901's flight plan.
Eh?
The update on Jim's flight plan corrected an error. It's been in the computer for God knows how long.
I don't understand.
His flight plan was a route over Erebus to the Takan. Previous flights seem to have taken them straight down McMurdo Sound.
Hell. Which one was Jim Collins briefed on?
This single question was to prove the axis around which the whole investigation would revolve. What had Jim Collins and his crew been told to expect? If their expectation was that they were to navigate down the expanse of McMurdo Sound, then in the hours before departure, subtly, silently, without word of warning, that expectation was to conflict with a new, revised reality. Could this have been the root cause of what was now being called the Erebus tragedy? Morrie Davies, for one, with his primary objective of protecting the airline's reputation, was certainly not prepared to entertain such a hypothesis. Rather, his and management's initial and immediate focus was squarely on the actions of the crew, and Captain Jim Collins in particular.
Still unanswered are questions as to how far and how quickly news of this discovery travelled.
There is no explanation as yet why TE901 was found well below its designated minimum altitude. The wreckage was sighted at 2,500 feet. The minimum altitude prescribed in the briefing is 6,000 feet.
Mr. Davis, are you saying that the pilot had taken the plane too low?
I cannot comment further than that.
Do you think the compasses were thrown out of alignment by the magnetic fields of the South Pole?
You're talking about the old DC-3 days. The DC-10 is fitted with an inertial navigation system which is the most sophisticated on any commercial airliner operating in the world today.
No mention of the change coordinates.
And it will tell you within yards exactly where you are.
On the 4th of December, Chief Pilot Ian Gemmell returns to Air New Zealand headquarters with an eyewitness account of the crash site.
All three engines were still delivering considerable power at impact. The engines never broke away prior to impact, neither did the wings.
So it doesn't appear to have been caused by any major structural or engine failure?
No.
So the DC-10 is in the clear?
I think so.
What does the Chief Inspector think?
I briefed him before I left the ice. He agrees. At this stage.
It is not known whether the change coordinates are discussed at this meeting. But later that afternoon, Gemmell does discuss them with Air New Zealand's in-house committee of inquiry, which has been charged with putting together a file on Flight 901 for the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents.
By the 30th of November, just 2 days after the accident, the occurrence of this mistake over the coordinates was known not only to Flight Operations Division, but also to the management of the airline, and in particular had been reported to the Chief Executive Morrie Davies. He saw at once what would happen if the story of the change coordinates became public. Within a day or two, the story would be carried by the world's newspapers, and indeed it would be a dramatic tale. The flight path of the DC-10 to be programmed into the aircraft's navigation computer had been first notified to the aircrew as taking it safely down the wide, flat expanse of McMurdo Sound. Then, only 6 hours before the aircraft departed, the destination coordinates had been changed, and the flight plan produced to the crew on the morning of the flight now contained an altered figure which set the aircraft, unbeknownst to them, upon a collision course with Mt.Erebus. A computer mistake had sent 257 people to a violent death on a distant frozen wasteland in Antarctica. Such would be the emotive content of news media headlines throughout the world. This might be the worst publicity to which the airline had ever been exposed. The reaction of the chief executive was immediate. He determined that no word of this incredible blunder was to become publicly known. He directed that all documents relating to Antarctic flights in general, and to this flight in particular, were to be collected and impounded. They were all to be put in one single file, which would remain in strict custody. Of these documents, all those which were not directly relevant were to be destroyed. They were to be put forthwith through the company's shredder. It was inevitable that these facts would become known. Perhaps the chief executive had only decided to prevent adverse publicity in the meantime, knowing that the mistake over the coordinates must in the end be discovered. He believed, as did everyone else at the time at Air New Zealand headquarters in Auckland, that the aircraft had been flying in cloud. The chief executive was anxious to avoid, no doubt, early and adverse publicity, which would place prime responsibility for the disaster upon the airline's management procedures. He maintained the view that the mistake was not an operative factor, and that the total culpability remained with the flight crew. This indeed was the case for the airline as presented to the subsequent investigation. It was based upon the proposition that the mistake over the coordinates had no significance. The silence over the changing of the coordinates and the failure to tell the aircrew was a strategy which succeeded to a very considerable degree. Indeed, the Chief Inspector, Ron Chippendale, only discovered these facts after he returned from the Antarctica on or about the 11th of December 1979, almost 2 weeks after the accident. The chief executive had directed the appointment of an investigation committee comprised of airline officials who were charged with the responsibility of assembling all the relevant documents, and they did this by impounding files held by route briefing officers and by the navigation section. The airline safety officer, Mr. Oldfield, was charged with the responsibility of arranging for the destruction of what were described as surplus copies of the documents placed upon the single file assembled by the committee. The instructions given by the chief executive with regard to destruction of documents were verbal. The instructions given by the committee to Mr. Oldfield were also verbal. The instructions given by the committee to those sections of Flight Operations Division which held Antarctic documents were also verbal. Actually, there was not a single memorandum produced to the subsequent investigation which described any of these instructions and the way in which they were carried out.
The following day, the chief executive reports to the full board for the first time.
901 appears to have hit Mt.Erebus at about 1,400 feet. And that appears to be off course. Considerably. The aeroplane was apparently attempting to descend into clearer air, but was left of center. Collins was one of our most proficient commanders. I can't think why he got into this position.
Were all the navigational systems functional?
As far as we can tell, Des, yes.
Deputy Chairman Des Dalgetty.
Well, we must watch out for the post-mortem syndrome. Everything we say and do is under scrutiny. There'll be lawyers from the US and here looking for information, so we must protect ourselves.
Des has suggested Lloyd Brown QC and David Williams as counsel.
They're the best combination of heavyweights I can think of. They'll do the job.
Well, perhaps you could instruct them on our behalf.
I've taken the liberty of instructing them already, Bill, on behalf of the board. And I've advised the Prime Minister.
Again, there is no mention of the change coordinates.
Now then, when does the Chief Inspector visit us?